seated. Who wants to be seated? If anybody wants to join, they're welcome to. Hello, my name is Myles Cupp. This is my fellow instructor, R.J. McKeehan. We come from Kron Martial Arts, which is principally based down in Orange County. We also have chapters in the Los Angeles area, up near Burbank. We have a group in the Inland Empire. We had a group up in the high desert for a while. I think they still meet sometimes. So I'm saying all this so in case you're wondering, wow, I already love swords. Just looking at these guys so much, where do I start? We are all over the place. So we're going to spend the next 15, 20 minutes talking about the martial arts of Renaissance Europe.
And fighting.
And we'll be fighting for you, right? So you don't just get to hear us talk about it. We will show you what it looked like. You might ask, how do we know what sword fighting looked like 500, 600 years ago? Well, actually the same way that we know how dances were done 500, 600 years ago. Those people in Renaissance Europe and medieval Europe had the good fortune to write down a lot of their techniques in fighting books that have survived to the modern day. This is a reprint of one from 1606 by Salvatore Fabris on rapier, if anybody wants to look at it later. But essentially, they wrote a whole series of different books, like books written by mercenaries teaching nobles how to fight, books written by retired knights who became monks and taught women how to sword fight, books on dueling, books on the etiquette of dueling, and we find these books in museums, private libraries, sometimes in churches undiscovered for centuries, translate them, read the words, look at the pictures, and say, how did they do it? How do they say to do it? We get historically accurate training replicas. These are historically accurate replicas of training longswords from the 1600s and 1500s. We have rapiers, and sometimes we get dressed up, not very often. Most of the time we train in modern safety equipment. So, like RJ's wearing some modern knickers that we use, and we have padded jackets and gloves. So we do everything safely at the same time. So we try to do it as authentically as possible and as safely as possible. So let's go forward in time with the weapons that we brought to show you guys tonight, beginning with the longsword. This was a two-handed weapon. You first start to see it appear in the 1300s, books that are written about it. It is a two-handed cutting weapon. So if I want to cut with RJ, I can do it. I can cleave his head open. I can cut his hand off. I can cut the lower part of his leg off pretty effectively with this weapon. It has two edges. So I don't just cut this way, I can also cut this way. Well, you might be wondering, why on earth would I ever want to cut with the back edge of my sword? So if RJ and I cut at each other like this, we defend, we may meet in a bind like this. So that's okay. There are things I can do from here, which I'll show you in a second. But let's say I want to be sneaky and RJ does that same attack at me. I'm hitting him with the back edge of my sword, and I'm deflecting him, and the books actually say, cut him at his right ear and you will sever it. So we trust that that works pretty effectively. I've never cut off anybody's ear doing that. You can also thrust with this weapon. So if RJ does that same attack against me, I can come in, block him in this guard, which we call the guard of the ox, because it looks like a horn coming out of my head. And I can drive this point right into his chest. End the fight as soon as it had begun. I can also use the pommel of my weapon to attack with. So how would that happen? So I could come in again here, boom, wrench, and then come in with the pommel to his face. The word pommel is actually where we get the word pummel from. Because if I manage to get in there really deep, and I can grab him here, I can come in here and just beat him to death until he cries uncle. So I don't just use the sword this way and this way. There are all kinds of other sorts of cuts. For example, RJ can launch his attack at me. I can cut crosswise with a horizontal strike. Let's say he defends that. He pushes off that way. I can come back the other way. Cut him on the other side. At speed, it might look like this. So here, and the fight's already over. The theme you might be able to pick up on at this point is that these are not slow, cumbersome weapons. People have heard that myth has been around for a long time, that swords weigh 10 pounds, they're so heavy, you use them to club the other guy to death. No, as you can see, these weapons are intended to be light, nimble, fast, furious, and deadly. Is there anything else about the longsword that I should say, that I have not said?
Every part of the longsword is a weapon. He showed you that the pommel is a fantastic weapon, the point is a fantastic weapon, the edges are weapons, the cross is also a weapon. we have techniques where we're actually going to end up flipping around, grabbing this, and striking with the cross of my sword, which seems bizarre. Why would I use this when I have a perfectly good edge? But if somebody's in armor, my edge is going to do absolutely nothing. In the movies, somehow they can hit people in armor and they die. That doesn't make sense. We need to use a pointed, heavy object that is similar to a polearm or an axe. And our longsword can become one. But I'm grabbing the edge. I'm going to get cut. No, you'll get cut if you rub your hand along the edge, not if you grip it strongly.
I can even grab my opponent's sword. Sure. RJ attacks me again. We end up in this bind that's right here. I can grab his tip and wrench it out of his hand and stab him. There's a special technique for doing this, in case you're curious, which is that you don't actually ever put your fingers like against the blade and start to do this. You will cut your own fingers off. But what I do is I put it against the palm and I pinch it. So the edge never actually touches my hand. And as long as I do this and I do it tightly and don't let the sword slide, I will be safe. So let's go forward in time a little bit. Huh? I do, but I'm not going to change the blade right now. I can demonstrate this. So you go forward in time a couple hundred years. The longsword still is in use, but it's not in use as much anymore for personal duels. You start to see beefier swords that are single-handed, which means that they're meant to be used only in one hand, not two hands. They're still pretty good at cutting. You can see how thick that blade is. And they're very good for slashing attacks and stabbing attacks pretty equally. In Shakespeare's time, the time of Romeo and Juliet, those weapons would have been extremely common. Those weapons would have been all over the place in Italy, in Germany, France, England, you name it, they'd be using those swords. You notice when I say they have complex hilts, they got better in later years at working metal, so they started to be able to put these fancy hand protection on there. So then if I am fighting with RJ and I cut down, his hand is going to be safe from this guy. What he can also do is that if he's attacking me, and let's say I cut at him, he can cut back, defend his own hand, and then just stab. All in one motion. Pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Then, about 50 years after that, so that weapon is from about the 1490s through to the 1580s, the 1590s, the early 1600s, those weapons start to get thinner and they start to get longer. Partly because of the way dueling practice has changed, and partly because of social fashion. People started to enjoy carrying thinner blades and using them more for a thrust-oriented game. Not that I can't cut with this, but I'm not going to cut someone's hand off with this. This blade is just much too thin. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to get low, and I'm going to approach my opponent very carefully, gaining on his sword, coming in, and lunging against him. This is the weapon that's associated with films like The Princess Bride. Now in The Princess Bride, what they like to do is they like to show theatrical fighting that looks very cutty, out of distance. We swing at each other's swords because we're trying to look cool for the film. In those days, I'm not trying to do big sweeping motions. I'm trying to stay underneath and behind my weapon to get under it. Drive around his defense using principles of geometry, mathematics, and good common sense. Anything else you want to add to that on the rapier? Well, yeah, let's get to Tebow. So that is the style of fencing that would have been done by the Italians. That low, squatting stance almost, like this. Very, very popular. There was another school of thought from Iberia in Spain, which said, no, you should stand upright. You should not put yourself low and do an exaggerated posture. You should stand upright and proud. Stare at your opponent and use a circle to approach him and walk around. And then RJ is attempting to subject my sword, pushing it out of the way, and essentially walking himself into my defeat. Of course, I would never just stand there and let him do that, but I want you to see how that system of fencing works. We will show you in action what that system we think might have looked like. We're still figuring out those details, but you'll get to see us fight with all of these styles this evening. That's why we're kind of moving through the history so we can get to the action. Does that sound good? I hope so.
One person says yeah.
Yeah, one person says yeah, sword fighting. Now the cool thing about the rapier, because it is a one-handed weapon, is that I have my other hand free to do things. So back in those days, you could carry a dagger as the side weapon. So I can come in and instead of using my sword to try and get around, I can take his sword out of the way with my dagger, and he can do the same, and we'll show you how this style works. Interestingly enough, Fabris talks about this in his book, and he has a whole chapter dedicated to how to fight with a cape. And he says two things about that. Why would we want to fight with capes? Number one, some city-states and Italy actually banned the carrying of daggers, but not swords. Is anybody curious why? No? Okay, I won't tell you.
Why?
All right, the reason is because they believe that the only people who would need to carry daggers around are assassins. So if you have a dagger on you, well, obviously you're intent on murdering somebody, so you're already guilty of attempted murder. So no daggers for you. But a cape, aha, they can't ban your cape. So I can show you a little bit about what cape might look like with my big modern fencing jacket. Ah, my elbows. I would come in, wrap it around my arm like this. And then if he cuts at me, I can actually receive that cut on my big, thick, heavy cape. Just stab into him. What I can also do is I can throw my cape onto his weapon and stab him. And I've never been able to get this to work right. Maybe I can get it. You take your cape off, throw it in his face, and then rush in and stab him. Oh, there goes the other elbow.
It's so embarrassing.
So if anybody has this idea of a sterilized fighting arts of Europe, they were pretty rough and dirty. And elegant at the same time, if you can imagine such a thing. So now we're going to work our way backwards in time, starting with a rapier, then the side sword, and then the long sword, and we'll demonstrate all the different fighting styles that we've talked about. And even then, this is just a narrow cross-section of what the fighting arts of Europe look like. I haven't talked about spears, shields, I haven't talked about just pure knife fighting, wrestling, you name it. Europe had it. Sickles, they had books on how to fight with sickles, and farm tools, all over the place, all these books exist. So give us a brief intermission while we get geared up in our modern equipment. And while I'm doing this, you want to say something? I'm sorry.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead with your thing, and then
I was just going to point out that he keeps saying modern jackets as if this is a Olympic sport fencing jacket or something like that. But actually, this is simply a modern reproduction of what they would call a gambeson, right?
That's
a gambeson
true.
is a fantastic form of armor. You would think that if you have just cloth, that's not going to work all that well for stopping a sword. But I'm actually a multiple champion in cutting with sharp swords, and I've done a lot of testing cutting textiles, fabrics such as this. And it's very, very difficult to cut through something like this. You're looking at 3, 4, up to 30 layers of linen layered on top of each other. And this is enough to stop most super committed sword blows, right? So, works well against cuts, not so well against thrusts. Fortunately for us, we don't have sharp tips or sharp edges, so we're pretty safe.
let's do Italian rapier and dagger. Okay. Then we'll do T-bow. Okay. And then we'll switch out for side sword. Together? What's that? Yeah. We could show rapier alone, but yeah, we'll do that very well. Hmm? Good.
Good.
So I can do blade locks with my dagger, and then he's pretty well done.
A duel does not last long. Oh. Very nice.
2 more?
Sure.
Ah. One more. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, one thing we cannot replicate is swords running through people. So, some of the actions we do actually may end up in a double hit. One of those, I thrust him in the leg and he cut me. Realistically, if I'm thrusting him in the leg or the body, I don't go like this and go, haha, I got you. I get here, put your hilt against my sword, and I drive it all the way into his chest. And drive him into the ground. The manuscripts tell us this. So sometimes we have a little bit of an artifact where we're not killing each other, but we get to have a lot more fun this way.
Yes. So now we're going to demonstrate fencing in the style of the Spanish.
Very good.
There. Yes.
So if you notice in the Italian system, we had a lot of disengaging, a lot of trying to find an opening and get there when he's not looking, in a sense. When we get to the Thibaut system, we want to maintain control all the way until the end. Thibaut does not believe in disengaging, because if I try to do something, if he tries to disengage and stab me there, all I have to do to defend myself is make my arm straight. So again, we're here. He thinks I'm clever, I will disengage. I stab him and I'm safe, right? So instead, we're trying to maintain contact and get all the way until our blade is almost at their face, and then just sort of lean in and kill them.
One more. Whew, very good. So some of the things that you can also do with the rapier is grab it at the half, spin around, and drive it into them, as I did just then. That's in the books. All right, so now switch it up for side sword. Come here.
End him rightly.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yes.
Did they ever fight on horseback like this?
Yeah, absolutely. They did fight on horseback, and actually a lot of the techniques were somewhat similar, not with rapiers, but typically with single-handed swords.
So later on?
No, in the same time period.
Earlier?
We're showing you all the cool weapons, right? Rapiers were really, really prominent and really well used in the Renaissance period. Long swords, you figure, were probably used all the time, all the way, because that's all you see when you think of a knight, right? Long swords are pretty terrible weapons on the battlefield. Does anybody have any idea why it would be a terrible battlefield weapon? You need both hands. That's a really good reason, right? So I've got two hands committed to a sword. That means I can't hold some sort of a buckler shield or something like that in my offhand, right? It's also very large, right? There's a lot of people around. I'm going to have a hard time. Imagine this is a long sword. Are we holding it? I'm going to have a hard time doing large cutting motions. If I have a shorter, say about this size, one-handed sword, I can cut and I can work in smaller areas and still be using my sword. Also on horseback, it's really hard to ride a horse and hold a sword with two hands. So we may want to use a one-handed sword for that as well. So long swords are cool. They were really popular but they weren't like the #1 sword on the battlefield. They were usually looking at shorter swords and stuff.
And there were indeed many books written on fighting from horseback, but RJ and I have never actually done any of that because owning a horse is very expensive.
And horses really don't like having swords swing next to their heads. It takes a lot of practice for them to get used to it.
There are schools that do it. There are modern knights, I say modern knights, modern practitioners of jousting who do those kinds of activities, and they train for years and train the horses for years to get them ready to do that. And they had to do that back in the 1500s as well. Sides. Try not to break my hand.
Yeah, in general. That's smart. Whoa. You are the side sword.
Yeah. Did I actually hit you?
Yeah, you did.
Oh, wow.
He's way better with the side sword than I am. He really likes this weapon.
You get to actually swash your buckle. Whoa.
Good.
Good, thank you. What's that? So you heard me say that with this weapon I really get to swash my buckle. I'm not actually joking even that much. I don't have any here with me tonight, but back in the period, they had these small shields that were about the size of a dinner plate that were called bucklers because you could buckle them to your belt. And Shakespeare coins that term, swashbuckler, because English students in London would be rabble-rousers and troublemakers, would take the bucklers off their belts, go into the city square, and bang them together to call people out for fights, just because it was fun. And you're drunk and you're going to raise trouble. That's one possible meaning of the word. The other one is that when you cut around the buckler, you might hit it. If you can imagine a dinner plate in my hand, I'm holding it like this, and I'm cutting around it. I might make a cling sound off of it, a swoosh, swash sound. So that's where we get that term. Okay. So now we've gone forward in time, and now back in time to the longsword.
So I mentioned this is not commonly used on a battlefield. You may be wondering, then when did they use it? They were used frequently. They were using for self-defense. They were used in judicial duels, which is exactly what it sounds like. We don't need to go to court. The duel is our court. So maybe Myles and I were happily married. We got in an argument. I decided to divorce him. And he says he gets all the land. And I say, no, I get all the land. We take it to court. The court says, well, you're going to have a duel over it. And God will be the judge because one of you is going to survive in the end. Really, really common that you'd use a longsword for that. A lot, can you tell?
again. Good. Right there.
Do you get bruises off there?
What's that?
Do you get bruises in that?
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
Do you get bruises on that?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
About the worst we get is bruises. Very infrequent to get anything worse than that. We have good gear. You're nice. Protect my hands.
2 more?
Yeah. Oh. He actually coming with the opening strike, right? Coming in.
1 more.
Side.
So, there's just a small demonstration and preview of the martial arts of Renaissance era. Thank you very much.